I heard the Mad Bull's science partner gored you pretty good today. Nancy shrugged and smiled. Jacob was one of the few white students who seemed to try and relate to her as a full-fledged member of the human race. Yeah, his gore is worse than his bite, but I've been subject to both. Nancy worked through the period with Rose, Jack, and Jacob. The class was preparing food for a lunch to be held the next day for the group of elders from the reserve. It was practically the only time they ever penetrated the walls of the school. Her group was working on baking bread, but they would also be frying bannock before the dinner. Nancy liked working in groups. While they worked, they talked easily and laughed. Rose was talking about her 3-year-old sister. She loves telling jokes, Rose giggled, but they never make sense. Like yesterday said, why did the chicken cross the road? Because the boy wore green pants. Sounds to me like she's getting into Zen Buddhism, Jacob commented. The respite soon ended. She contemplated on what was ahead of her. Social studies before lunch with the endless story of Canadian Confederation, 2 periods of English after lunch, full of prepositional phrases, faulty parallelism, and literature as far removed from her reality as possible. Then algebra. Hours of sitting alone, mirrored in skeins of strange, useless numbers and letters. She passed by the locked glass case where the awards were kept. There was a few minor sports trophies, a list of graduates arranged by year, and a plaque with the name of the recipients of last term's academic awards. 9 out of 10 were white, Nancy thought, in a school that is more than half Indian. And the one Indian guy who snuck in was about as Indian as Stanley Quigley. He lived in a white foster home and regarded the Indian students with a sort of disdain and disgust that only a convert can feel. But Nancy was going to get her name up there on this year's graduate list. She told herself she could put up with 3 more months of boredom. When Indian students looked around, they saw a future for themselves and success for the handful of white students. It was the Indian students who were slotted into the vocational tracks. It was the Indian students who ended up in remedial classes. It was they who found themselves at the bottom of the class standings. But who could blame the school? After all, it had the weight of the cinder block buildings and the expertise of college-trained educators. Teachers knew their subjects, and administrators sternly indicated the success was equally available to all. Who could argue with the school? So there had to be something wrong with them, the students, the Indians. Nancy knew there was more to it than that. This was the explanation the school wanted them to accept, but Nancy remembered things too clearly. She recalled her wide-eyed panic as she was shoved into a grade 1 classroom with a white teacher who jumped up and down, flailing her arms, her voice raising and falling like she was berserk. Nancy remembered, too, a bunch of white students who acted exactly the same way as she sat silently, trying to figure out what those people were doing, feeling more and more alone as the Indian kids slid deeper into their little desks, afraid even to look at each other. It wasn't long before she noticed that when she and the other Indian kids held the unfamiliar books full of unfamiliar faces and words, they found themselves in the reading groups where boys and girls readed haltingly or not at all. Then the teacher began to frown at them, and when she had been signaled out and told to read in front of the class, she wanted to sink through the floor. When Nancy thought about it even now, 11 years later, she shuddered in remembered shame and terror. She'd sat there dumb and frightened, unaccustomed to performing on command or in front of a group. Soon she came to hate and fear the classroom with its daily terror, loneliness and humiliation. Where were the words and soft smiles of her homes and relatives? Where were the gentle encouragements of her grandmother and the wonderful trips up the valley to pick berries and play in the sunflowers? The result of all this loss, all this hurt, were too clear. By grade 3, most of her friends saw themselves as failures, and by grade 8, they had failed 1 or 2 grades. But somehow Nancy hung on, and soon became stronger and more bitter, but determined. She could fully understand and explain what was wrong with the school. It was too vague and confusing, and things about it just made her angry and frustrated. But she could be one who made it, who waded through all the crap and got out alive, and she would do it as an Indian. A group of young Indian boys pushed past her, uniformed in cut-off jeans with the names of various rock bands stitched crudely on the back. They were oblivious to her or anyone else. She saw that one of them was her first cousin, Pat Antone. He was pretending to drive. Man, when I get some money together, I'm going to buy the biggest 4x4 you've ever seen. I'm going to roar up the logging roads like a madman, spewing gravel all over the place. Maybe I'll even enter that mugbog race over in Falkland. It'll be great. Pat made the sounds of a straining motor. Nancy shook her head. She didn't know whether to be disgusted or depressed. Damn it, Pat, when are you going to grow up? She snapped. Pat just sneered at her and kept on shifting gears down the hallway. Suddenly the bell screamed above her head. She flinched instinctively and darted towards her social studies class. Zachary Taylor, their young teacher, paced nervously in front of the class. He always seemed somewhat frantic. His lectures, and that's what most of the classes consisted of, were essentially summaries of the reading assignments, adding little or nothing to the subject. But Taylor seemed to try to make up for the failure of his material with what he probably saw as enthusiasm. He gestured dramatically, lashing the air as he spoke. All this activity and angularity just made Nancy nervous. She had a vague fear of one of his bony elbows was going to slam into her temple during one of his more energetic gestures. Today, Taylor launched into a vigorous review, almost word for word from the text, of the Canadian Confederation debates. These were great men of great wisdom. Carter, MacDonald, and Brown were all men of fierce conviction, but they were willing to put philosophical differences aside to create a new nation. They knew that the only thing between them and a country from the Atlantic to the Pacific was regional mistrust and a lack of imagination. Yeah, and a few 100,000 Indians, muttered Cyril Narcisse from the back. Taylor faltered for a moment. Well, yes, that too, but that's another issue. We won't get into that this year. He quickly regained his stride. Where today is the boldness and the courage, the vision. Where today is the boldness, the courage, the vision these men had? Where is the willingness to face the issues squarely and resolutely? Nancy could feel her face flush. She hated talking out in class, but suddenly she felt she had to. How about the bridge? Let's talk about an issue that affects us here, our people here and now. Why don't we talk about that? It's more important than talking about what a bunch of guys did 100 years ago. Why don't we talk about that? Nancy had to stop and breathe deeply. Taylor had stopped mid-gesture, his arm still raised in the air. Nancy spoke more calmly now, but more intently. You're always talking about what changes people made in their lives in the past. Why not help us learn to make changes for our people's lives now? 7 people have died on that bridge. We have to force the railroad to put up a walkway. Help us organize. We could get up a petition or stage a blockade. At this, Taylor began to motion his open hand towards her as if to soothe her. Help us do something, she finished. Taylor gulped once. Then he took a step back and sat on his desk. He shook his head. Nancy, he began at his most patient, forbearing voice. Those are interesting ideas, but we just don't have the time. We'll be hard-pressed to finish the text as it is. Furthermore, that sort of a topic is not in the curriculum. You should take this matter up with your band. Having regained his composure and the initiative, Taylor resumed. As I was saying, on March 11, 1865, at 4 in the morning, the question of Confederation came to a vote by members from Canada East and West. The vote was 91 to 33 in favor, and Nancy went limp. Her outburst had hardly caused a ripple. This class was back on track, hurtling again ahead into the tunnel of lifeless facts and meaningless details. Taylor's words droned on. Through the narrow windows at the front, she could just get a glimpse of the river struggling through the rugged walls of the canyon. She was tired of struggling. 3 more hours. Not today. At the bell, she walked out of the school into the bright spring sunshine, and headed down the hill. She wouldn't be back this afternoon. They had won, she thought. This day. End of chapter 2.